Okay. The world has enough going on right now without me trawling the frigid depths of Twitter to find something funny to comment on. But then this ended up on TMZ, so I feel like I kind of have to throw my hat into the ring. My white boy hat, which I guess would be a fedora, though fedoras were originally a woman's hat, I think. What's the true white boy hat? Like the is it just a baseball cap? I don't know. Anyway, Anne Frank. She had white privilege? Twitter debates. This should be my YouTube titles. Okay, I know. I know this is very low-hanging fruit, but I swear I'm going to make something productive out of this, okay? So, yeah, Twitter discourse. Now, as is often the case when stuff like this blows up, the discourse is like 1% the original bad take, and 99% people making fun of the bad take. So, I don't think this is necessarily indicative of a gigantic surge of crazy lefties who are arguing that Anne Frank should be canceled for failing to account for her white privilege in her diary or whatever. Just a few crazies here, but I think there's something interesting to pull on here. Okay, um, when did this person block me? When did I block this person? You know what? I'm not even getting into it. It's every time, man. Hold on, I want to make sure I say this carefully. Yeah, Anne Frank had white privilege. Bad things happen to people with white privilege also, but don't tell the whites that. Okay, wow. What a statement. Let's break it down. Whew, let's break it down, huh? Yeah, okay. So apparently the broader context of the discourse was people arguing whether or not I think it originally started with the idea that white queer people have privilege in the incoming fascist dystopia over non-white people because white queer people are capable of disguising the fact that they're queer, which is true to an extent, though the efficacy of that is kind of called into question by modern surveillance methods. But whereas non-white people have no way of hiding the fact that they're non-white. And then this got turned into other arguments over visible versus invisible privilege. And then you have Anne Frank, who was, of course, white, but also Jewish. And you can kind of see how the discourse spiraled out of control there. Um, so obviously this is phenomenally stupid, even having this conversation. It's a little bit like talking about like the height privilege of like Native Americans who were killed by marauding bands of Western expansionist American pioneers. It's a phenomenally brain damaged topic. It just sort of radiates an aura of stupidity around it. There's really no reason to talk about it at all. But I think there's something interesting underneath the first layer of crippling stupidity that I wanted to touch on that actually relates to another Twitter thread that I saw. I saw this right before, and I can't see the whole thread now because the person who made the original thread hid all of their tweets. But this is another one of those times where like more of the discourse has been condemning the original take than the prior. But in this case, the original thread got tens of thousands of likes, which was yeah. So I was let me see if I could find it 1 second. If I was smart, I would have had this up already. I think it's in my close history. Yeah, Frida Kahlo, the known wisely by many of my American compatriots as Mexican Eyebrow Lady, the famed artist and advocate for indigenous rights and so on. There was some big thread canceling her by saying that she's actually mixed race or was appropriating the culture because she's mestizo or whatever. Here we go. Yeah. I don't know who needs to hear this, but Frida Kahlo was a white woman who larved as an indigenous person so she could get support as an artist. The regalia you see in her work is not anything from her family, but from the Oaxaca, I'll take a guess, who often worked in her house. This is a lie. It's just untrue. She wore her grandma's clothes. You can see it's, yeah. I'm kind of stumbling through this a little bit here because I want to get at a point and I don't want to showcase the fact that I know almost nothing about this woman. But there's a broader point that I want to make, okay? And it's I feel like it's pretty obvious that we're living in an era of rapidly increasing reactionary sentiment. And I think in times like this, there's often a kind of circular firing squad mentality that people develop where they try to fight over like the pathetic trickle of privilege that they can get or deny with other people who are in similar positions. Contra talked about this a lot, the idea that people who are in close proximity to each other are more likely to fight over clout that is sort of collectively potentially theirs than they are to unite against like the broader issue or the groups that are maybe more deserving of criticism. We see this all throughout history in the form of worker struggles where it's the primary goal often of the capitalist to exacerbate and uh, prompt as much infighting as possible amidst the working class. If you have people arguing over racial or ethnic or national divisions, they're less likely to realize that, people of all colors and creed are being oppressed by the bourgeoisie, workers of the world unite, etc., etc. And the way this takes shape in like racialized discourse, especially amidst non-privileged people, like POC or members of ethnic minorities, is always really interesting because obviously, as a proud advocate for racial equality, I am fully of the opinion that racial minorities are capable of being completely fucking insufferable, just like non-racial minorities, as a real ally to the people of color around the world. Truly, we're all of us are our souls are capable of just immeasurably distasteful behavior, as evidenced by the Anne Frank stuff. That clearly that's something we're all capable of repping. But there's an underlying current of essentialism here that I think connects these two instances of brain damage. That's the more interesting thing that I wanted to touch on here. Talking about white privilege with Anne Frank, and apart from the obvious problems with that. But in addition, talking about like Frida's alleged appropriation of indigenous culture in Mexico, despite, it running in her family and so on, I think that there's an underlying trend of implied racial essentialization there that people are running to as a defense mechanism in times of racial crisis, which we certainly are in, given the state of politics in this country and the um, explicit attitudes towards race issues that Republicans have adopted. Um, oh God, my brain is so scattered. Oh, imagine if I was trying to do this while live streaming. Let me try to take a step back. Let me think of it this way. Okay, what is the problem with the statement Anne Frank had white privilege? Anne Frank was white. I mean, there are photos of the girl, right? And white people in Germany at that time would have been privileged over non-white people. I mean, right? So why does the statement Anne Frank had white privilege, cause brain damage? Well, the immediate assumption would be because, obviously, she died in the Holocaust, which sort of erases any potential marker of privilege. But I actually think that's a bad counter argument because it's anti-intersectional. The argument that Anne Frank couldn't have had white privilege because she was targeted for being Jewish would be tantamount to saying that men can't have privilege in the case of like a black man who was targeted for his race. Does this black guy who got shot by the police, does he have like male privilege? Also a good brain damage question, by the way. and and the answer in that case would be yeah. That well, yeah, he would have male privilege. It just wouldn't have been relevant to the circumstances of his killing because it was more of a race thing, probably. Though with police shootings, it is a race and gender thing. Black men are far more likely to get shot by police than black women are. And frankly, the criminal justice system is actually more biased against men in general than it seems to be along racial lines, as I understand it. But we kind of overlook that. It's pretty cringe. Um, in terms of disparate sentencing and what have you. But anyway, um, so where's the brain damage coming from? I think you could argue that it's a kind of like wrong time, wrong place situation. Like, okay, maybe Anne Frank had white privilege. Sure, maybe. But clearly it wasn't relevant to like the life that she lived. You know what I mean? Like, sure, fine, maybe. But that's not really what determined the trajectory of her life and the experiences she had with more powerful institutions. It wasn't exactly her whiteness that determined the nature of those interactions. It was her Jewishness. Um, and it is true, it is a wrong time, wrong place thing, but I still don't think that's a valid counterargument. I actually think the main sort of brain damage aura generation unit here would come from the fact that whiteness as a concept is a really, really fluid and historically contextual thing, and applying it in retrospect to somebody like Anne Frank, when the racial dynamics of Nazi Germany were very, very different to the racial dynamics of modern day America, which is what we're using as a sort of reference frame when we talk about white privilege. And you have to, by the way. Whenever a person talks about white privilege, they're talking from a reference point. Privilege, much like speed, exists only in reference to other things. There's no such thing as innate privilege in a truly, fundamental sense. It has to be contextualized by something, much in the same way that, I may be moving at 0 miles per hour relative right now to the ground, but I'm moving tens of thousands of kilometers per hour relative to the sun. Oh God, I just accidentally slipped into kilometers there. The Eurofication. Truly, I must be sick. If you talk about white privilege here in the States, you're using the States as a reference point. White privilege here is not white privilege elsewhere, Are white people privileged in the same way in Japan or, India or Russia? It's different everywhere. And in some places, that privilege on an individual level might be relatively minute because white privilege, as is the case with most ethnic privileges around the world, is usually tied into a kind of uh, national place of belonging. White people are privileged in America and much of Europe because these are presumed to be white countries in the sense that they were historically governed predominantly by white people, usually by white supremacists who built systems with the assumption that they would exist for the benefit primarily of white people. And, this poisons the groundwater. It takes a while to get out. But if you go over to, say, India, there are privileges associated with you being there, but how much of that is white privilege versus American privilege? How much of that is the privilege of relative wealth? If you go over to India, odds are you're going to be wealthier than the vast majority of people who are there just because it's a poorer country than here. But if you're of the same socioeconomic status, and let's say you were born in India as a white person, do you have privilege there as that? Maybe, yeah, in some ways. I imagine in some other ways you would probably be treated like a bit of an outsider in the same way that many non-white people are treated as outsiders in places in Europe and America. That's not to say white privilege doesn't exist, only that it's contextual. The context that you are sort of referring to when you use that term is Amerocentric in online discourse, unless specified otherwise, because America rules the world. And it is highly inappropriate to apply that framework to a place like Nazi Germany, which has such an incredibly different attitude. I don't need to go into that, do I? About the racial politics of Nazi Germany to explain why there's a difference, Not to say there aren't, commonalities. There are plenty of Nazi supporters in America at the time and are still today. Uh, but things were different. Certainly for Anne Frank, who, if she had been regarded only by whiteness in America then or today, probably would have been treated as a member of the hegemonic power group. And in Germany, she was killed for it. So, it's the essentialization that bothers me. It's the way people will default to modes of understanding that make sense to them now and then try to apply them everywhere at every point in time in this universalist it's not even a word, universalist, it's universal, this just wide spanning framework that kind of essentializes the issue at hand. It makes whiteness out to be an essential category. Whiteness isn't just having light skin, after all. Being white was just not a thing 4,000 years ago. Light-skinned people were a thing 4,000 years ago, but our understanding of what it means to be a white person is a relatively modern phenomena. Like you couldn't go back to 4,000 years ago and go like, oh yes, of course. Well, we have white people up here in the north, and then we have swarthy Mediterranean people down here in Greece. It'll be called Greece one day. Then these are black people in northern Africa. And like, okay, so these are Middle Eastern people, and they're kind of like half black, half Asian. That's how the races work. You could get halfway through explaining this to some like Macedonian soldier before they club you over the head and eat you. I don't know what the Mesopotamian? I don't know. They don't. It wasn't like that back then. They had their own stupid, arbitrary ways of categorizing people. We wouldn't want to make universal the category of whiteness, because if we did that, we would be legitimizing it. We would be bolstering it, and I think that's dumb. The Frida Kahlo thing goes right back into this too. The idea of accusing, a mixed race person of appropriating indigenous culture, even though they're descendant from indigenous people, suggests a weird kind of self-defeating logic where you guarantee the extinction of indigenous culture outside of the racially pure indigenous circles, which is kind of weird. There is an unfortunate tendency to adopt. Do I want to open this can of worms? Yeah, a lot of non-white communities online get very comfortable expressing disdain towards mixed race people in ways that white people would get more easily canceled for. Um, I think that a lot of POC, maybe not a lot of, a decent number of them, they understand that many of their negative experiences in life, which are a product of their race, are less seriously experienced by mixed race people. Like a very dark-skinned black person is subject to more severe racial bias than a light-skinned black person. That's true. There are studies to back it up. So a very dark-skinned black person might think, okay, well, a light-skinned black person is probably somewhere along the line mixed race. So they're not really black. And they're actually appropriating my struggle if they claim that they are, because et cetera, et cetera. The discourse rages on. What's weird is that this often gets, sort of jokingly euphemized as like light skin versus black skin. Oh, wait, sorry. Light skin versus dark skin. They're both black. Discourse in a lot of places online, when it's fundamentally like a jokey version of a race struggle between pure blood and mixed race people of color. Like, it's actually really weird. Every once in a while I see discourse online that I feel like is being pulled straight out of Stormfront, but it's not being treated that way because it's an intra minority community discourse rather than like a between different races discourse, which would be more immediately framed as like a you know like a horribly racist thing. I think it reminds me a little bit of the TERF discourse, to be honest, where the TERFs are pretending that they think womanhood is defined like in part by lived experience. So a trans woman can't be a woman because they didn't, they oscillate back and forth between the biology thing and the, oh, well, you didn't have the woman's experience, as though all women have the same experience as cis or trans growing up. Um, but they use the perceived lack of an experience as a way to gatekeep the boundaries of their identity, which I guess happened here with the Frida Kahlo thing. And in a way, I feel like also with the Anne Frank thing, because impugning Anne Frank for being white is kind of the same thing as pushing her out of the non-white category, Like, white and non-white are the only two things anything can be. It's, you're pretty much in category A or B, no matter what. a very all-encompassing dynamic there. And if the impulse to point out that Anne Frank had white privilege was a product of somebody trying to argue that there are forms of visible and invisible lack of privilege, and that Anne Frank, by being white, was visibly privileged, but invisibly through Jewishness, non-privileged in the same way that white queer people are, this really does just kind of seem like a roundabout way of pushing somebody out of the category of legitimately visibly oppressed, which in a racialized dynamic does translate pretty well into the white or non-white framework. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that thinking about this is a gigantic waste of time, and every nanosecond of thought and every neuron that you dedicate to like pondering whether or not people are being appropriately considerate of whether or not they may think that they have the appropriate skin tone or ancestry to weigh in on this or that. Like, think about anything else, like literally anything else that you can. It's a complete waste of time. There is nothing here. There's literally nothing here. Even when it gets dressed up in academic jargon, I genuinely think it's a fucking waste of time. It's a descriptive versus prescriptive thing, okay? If academics, intellectuals, and Twitter dipshits alike want to like sit together and talk about like the incredible range of cultural experiences or like what people have gone through, what they've suffered or benefited from, what they think about things, Godspeed. It's an accumulation of knowledge thing. But the moment this turns into an attempt to gatekeep whether or not other people have the right to do this, that, the other, based on some arbitrary like association or set of categories, I don't care. I have literally, in my whole life, I've never seen that discourse amount to anything. I'm honestly asking, have you guys? I'm really asking now, have you ever in your life seen an instance of people online sitting down and going, I don't think this person has checked their privilege enough, or I don't think this person was of the appropriate skin tone to have this thought or opinion that I don't disagree with on its own, but I still don't think it should have come from them. Have you ever seen that happen and something good has come from it? Because I really don't think I ever have. Obviously I'm a white boy, so my perspective isn't going to be the same as everyone else's, but like, I've just never seen it happen. It just seems to be like a fundamental waste of time. It's a phenomenal psyop, if done well. All it takes is some 4chan trolls jumping on social media to talk about how Martin Luther King Jr. should have checked his male privilege or whatever, then scatter off while people, start exploding with discourse in the comments. I don't know. This whole thing has been incredibly rambling. I'm so tired. I'll be streaming soon. I love you.